the New Jersey Center for Tourettes Syndrome and Associated Disorders. Its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Thanks, Kelly. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Tonight's webinar is the second in our two-part series on disclosure. Part 1 was presented by Dr. Lori Rockmore on November 2nd. Tonight's presenter is Dr. Robert Zambrano. This is the third time Dr. Zambrano has presented a webinar for us. He previously addressed the issue of parenting a child with TS and co-occurring disorders, and that was in March of 2010. And in October of 2013, he spoke on school refusal. He received his undergrad degree from East Stroudsburg University in Pennsylvania, his Master of Psychology and Doctor of Clinical Psychology from the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. He currently works in private practice at Stress and Anxiety Services in East Brunswick, New Jersey. Prior to that, he was on the staff at the Tourette's Syndrome Clinical Program at Rutgers University. Dr. Zambrano specializes in working with children and adults with OCD, depression, and other anxiety disorders, as well as Tourette syndrome. He has received certification from the Behavioral Therapy Training Institute through the International OCD Foundation. He is also certified by the Trichotillomania Learning Center in the treatment of trichotillomania and other body-focused repetitive behaviors. Additionally, he does presentations for educators and professionals across the state on the behalf of our organization, NJCTS, and also for OCD-NJ, where he serves on the board of directors. Dr. Zambrano, we're delighted to have you back, and I'm pleased to turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you, Marty. It's good to hear from Marty and Kelly. So before we begin today, as I typically do before a presentation, I spend a lot of time going through my slides, making sure I caught any spelling or grammatical errors. I'm sure you guys will find some that I missed. That's okay. But in the process of doing so, as I'm sure a lot of your children probably can attest to, I got a little distracted and went on Facebook. So I was glad I did, because I saw a little video today that I really found kind of touching, and I think it serves as a nice introduction to today's topic. So I'm going to play it. It lasts about a minute. I hope you guys can all see it. Enjoy. So I saw that, and I'll give you guys all a second to dry your tears. And I was really moved by it, and I thought it really sort of captured the spirit of some of what I want to talk about today. As you can tell from the video, oh, and by the way, I don't know if anybody else can see, I'm sorry to interrupt, guys, to Marty and Kelly, can anybody see that box that's in the right-hand corner, or is that just me? Because I want to make sure it's not blocking people's visual.
That's just you. You can
Okay.
click the orange arrow and get it out of your way.
Okay, let me do that real quick so that you guys can't see it, but there was something in the middle of the presentation obscuring my view. So sorry about that interruption. So again, I thought that video was really touching, and I think it sort of captures the spirit of what I wanted to talk about this evening. As you can see, that child was hiding behind a mask of his or her own. In this case, clearly some sort of health issue. By the way, what a great dad in that video as well, somebody really supportive and nurturing. And you could see at the end sort of the potential power for disclosure, that once the child's classmates had a sense of what was going on with that child, they could then become supportive of that child. The whole community can embrace when they have a greater understanding of what's going on. And so again, I thought that was a really lucky thing that I saw today, because it really kind of captures the spirit of what I want to talk about. So as Marty mentioned, this is a part 2 of this presentation. The first part was presented by the very brilliant Dr. Laurie Rockmore, who I worked with for a number of years at Rutgers. So if you want to watch that video in the archive, you can go to the website for njcts.org, highlight the tab that says Programs, click on Webinar Archives, and then you can go to the presentation that was done on November 2nd. There's probably going to be a lot of overlap between what she had to say and what I had to say. Have to say this evening, but I think if nothing else, if I'm reinforcing some good messages, I think that's a good thing. Anyhow, I also wanted to make everybody know that this isn't only a Tourette's presentation. Today we're going to be focusing on various symptoms that come with Tourette's syndrome, not just tics, but the other facets of the diagnosis. However, this presentation could also apply to disclosure of non-neurological disorders regarding medical conditions, physical limitations, allergies, etc. So I really do think this applies to a lot of things and can cover a lot of ground. So some goals for today's presentation. First of all, I want us to be able to learn how to discuss how to decide if you should disclose a mental illness to the community. We should review the pros and cons of disclosing mental illness to the community. We also want to be able to discuss when to disclose. We're going to discuss which members of the community and institutions should the mental illness be disclosed to. And we're going to review different ways to make these disclosures. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to go over some specific case examples of situations that some children deal with and how to apply this to the community at large. Don't know why it's doing that. There we go, sorry. So let's start by talking about when to disclose. So I think if the symptoms are obvious and not explaining the symptoms would be more disruptive, I think that is a good time to disclose. If the symptoms require special accommodations to function normally, then that again is a good situation to disclose, especially when we're talking about school situations or certain organizations that may be more likely to provide accommodations if there's an actual diagnosis that can be provided, and if they can have contact with experts in the community who can give specific recommendations regarding those specific diagnoses. So it's always helpful, I find, to get certain organizations to be more flexible about taking care of these things. If the person with the mental illness doesn't want to keep a secret, so sometimes a person might have a mental illness and it may not be disruptive or require certain accommodations, but it might sometimes be difficult to keep what might feel like an important secret. It might be a stressor in and of itself to sort of be afraid that somebody might find out. Another reason to disclose is if the person with the mental illness wants to feel supported. Much like in that video we saw, that was a situation where the community can come together and give support to the person who may feel like they need it. If the person with mental illness wants to destigmatize mental illness and educate others. Now, just as a plug again for the New Jersey Center for Tourette's Syndrome, who I've been doing presentations for many years for, and it's an excellent organization. I'm really proud to be a part of the team. Some of the best things I've seen in the time working with this organization, I should say, is when kids with Tourette syndrome give presentations on their Tourette's. These are some of the bravest, most amazing kids, and they really do want to educate others so that some of their some other people who might have Tourette's would have an easier time of dealing with this. And I find that I think their ability to present on this and talk about this openly not only helps others, but really helps them as well. So I'm always inspired by the students who are willing to share details of their illness with others. If the person for mental illness wants to advocate for others, again, this similar to what I just said, I think is a good time to disclose. When not to disclose, however, is also important to discuss. So if the person with a mental illness doesn't want to, of course, that's first and foremost. We should never force somebody to disclose an illness if they aren't ready, if they don't want to. Now, of course, there can be situations where a family feels very strongly that it's an important disclosure to make. And ultimately, certainly, I think parents would have to make that call and figure out how to do that discreetly. But ideally, this should be discussed with the child, negotiated with the child, and explained to the child why this could benefit them. Very often you do find resistance with children not wanting mental illnesses to be disclosed, but I think if we do an effective job of explaining the benefits of this and, you know, going over with the child how this can be shared discreetly and at a pace that they're comfortable with, then that's how we can get them to disclose. But ultimately I feel like it shouldn't be disclosed without the child's say-so or involvement. If the mental illness is not obvious to others, then of course that might be a situation where it's not necessary to disclose, and so we may choose not to. If the mental illness does not impact the ability to function normally, again, this could be a situation where we choose not to disclose. So I've had people over the years with OCD, but the OCD does not have any impact on their ability to function in the community. Very often certain manifestations of OCD typically only happen around the home for certain reasons. So that might be a situation where unless the child has a very strong sense of advocacy or wanting to educate others, there really is no need to inform others. If there's a reason to believe that the cons will outweigh the pros. So let's talk about, first of all, the cons, the downside of disclosing. One of the most common things you hear is concern about stigma. So the fear that somebody will be labeled with that once somebody knows the label of the mental illness diagnosis, that there will be some sort of stigma about this. I'm finding, fortunately, as the years go by, there's less and less of a stigma about mental illness, especially when we get into the specifics. You know, typically there might be more of a stigma about someone saying, I am mentally ill, versus saying, I have OCD, I struggle with social anxiety, I have Tourette's syndrome, because the more specific we get, the more we can put a human face on things and the more we can describe, whereas mental illness being sort of an ambiguous term maybe leaves people open to their imagination. But again, there still can be stigma from some people who might be more ignorant about the disorders. Of course, there could be concern about bullying. There can be teasing that happens, so that certainly is a potential downside of disclosure. The possibility of being treated differently than others. I've often heard from kids who express frustration about once they are diagnosed and once people become aware of the diagnosis, that there is some concern that anytime that many of their behaviors can be seen through the lens of that disorder. I work with a lot of people with obsessive compulsive disorder. Very often people with OCD express frustration that everyone thinks everything they do is OCD. So for example, I've had many young people with OCD that might have counting rituals who just happen to be organized, but it's not organized in an obsessive kind of way, and yet people who know they have OCD might see them being organized and think, oh, that's part of your compulsion. It might not be. So that can be irritating to be viewed through that lens of everything you do is suspect and could it potentially be a part of the mental illness. The possibility of being stereotyped and that others, oh, I think I just said that. So the possibility of being stereotyped and that others will only view you through the lens of the illness. Lower expectations from others can again be a concern, especially in situations where certain accommodations are required. We want to make sure that everybody understands that the mental illness in and of itself doesn't really speak to a person's ability or intellect, and so therefore we shouldn't have lowered expectations just because a person needs accommodations. They are just as likely to be able to get good grades and learn if they are given the resources they need. So for example, if a person had a problem with vision and they were wearing glasses, that's an accommodation. We wouldn't have lower standards for them as a student because they have a vision problem. We would provide accommodations and hold them to the same standard. The other concern that parents often express is a built-in excuse for not trying hard or taking responsibility. And to be honest with you, I don't see this very often. I've been working in this field for almost 20 years, and rarely have I ever seen kids with any kind of mental illness who use that as an excuse to not do work or try hard. Now, sometimes it can be confusing because, let's say, for example, a person who's suffering from significant depression may have a hard time finding the motivation to work hard on something, but it typically isn't that they're using it as an excuse so much as they haven't figured out how to overcome their lack of momentum or difficulty dealing with the emotion that's involved. But it is a concern, of course, and so the best we can do is provide the accommodations that could be helpful. And sometimes if a person says they can't do something, my job as a therapist and our job as people working with these children is to sort of start at, okay, what can you do, and then build upwards from there. So I don't take no for an answer. Instead, I say, okay, if you can't do this, can you do that? And then we kind of figure out where the basement is and we try and climb to the ceiling. The pros, the upside of disclosure. A person may not have to live in fear of others finding out about the mental illness. They may, the ability to gain understanding and support from peers and community at large. They are more likely to gain protection from peers and community at large. I very often find, again, that once people have an understanding of what the mental illness is and the impact that it has on a person's life, the people around them who understand this are more likely to stand up for and protect somebody. Much like we saw, again, in that video that I keep referencing that we just saw at the beginning, that group, you know, they all stood up for that child, having a better understanding of what was going on with him or her. The child's name was Alex, which I guess can go either way, name-wise. Anyway, accommodations can be made that make it easier for the person with mental illness to function normally across challenging situations. This is one of the main pros of disclosure. Now again, there's also the downside of not disclosing. Very often what I find, and I think one of the biggest downsides, is in the absence of information, people will feel free to interpret symptoms however they like, but it's more likely to be unfavorable. So, you know, I very often see this with people who have Tourette's, and Tourette's often comes with impulsivity. It often comes with motor and vocal tics, and especially with younger children who may not know what Tourette's is or have heard of it, they're, in the absence of knowing what the diagnosis is and what it means, they make interpretations about the child's behavior. Oh, they're just being attention-seeking, they're being silly, they're weird, etc. So the more we can inform people, the less likely these misunderstandings can happen, and again, we can get appropriate support, empathy, and good treatment. Another downside of not disclosing is, of course, the longer you wait, the harder it can become. I once worked with a young man many years ago who his symptoms were very mild until adolescence. The symptoms got a little bit more severe, and at that age, he was very uncomfortable, more uncomfortable, I think, than he would have been when he was younger, speaking to a classroom, disclosing to classmates. And if we had, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but I guess the potential downside of not disclosing is if the symptoms get worse, it's often harder for an older child, especially a teenager, to disclose than it is a younger child. Another downside is the person with the disorder. Again, I know I keep pressing on this, but they very often do live in fear that others will find out and judge them, and so that's why we want to get ahead of this curve and be able to sort of explain on our terms. They may live in fear of how they might be treated when other people find out. So a lot of them, helping them deal with this fear is having them find out. Let's start telling people and see how they treat you. If they treat you differently, then our job is to teach you how to respond to that. But very often what we find is people don't treat you that differently once they have an understanding of what's going on. We also know that not disclosing takes a lot of your ability to control the situation out of your hands. So again, if a teacher or a troop leader, a church, someone in the church doesn't have an understanding of what's going on, then how you might be treated in response to some of your symptoms might be taken out of your hands. So the idea of disclosure is to be able to control the situation and inform others so that they can provide the help you need. And again, not disclosing can make it harder to get helpful accommodations, especially again if there's ignorance or misunderstanding as to why the child might be struggling. So if there's a belief that somebody's being willful or attention-seeking, they're far less likely to get the kind of help that they could benefit from. So when is it time to disclose? If and only if the person with the mental illness is ready and willing to disclose, when the symptoms are obvious to others and saying nothing could be more disruptive in the long run, when others not knowing leads to being misunderstood and mistreated, when it's time to ask for reasonable accommodations, when the anxieties of others finding out becomes disruptive to normal functioning, if the person with the mental illness and the family want to be preemptive. So like that story I mentioned earlier with the young man whose symptoms got worse as he got older, one way to look at it is, especially with Tourette's and a lot of other disorders, the symptoms can get worse during puberty, so perhaps during pre-adolescence we train the child to be able to disclose and not be ashamed and not live in hiding. And again, it's easier to do when we're younger, so that's that preemptive approach that I'm talking about. Timing disclosures. Ideally, it can happen at the beginning of the school year or when joining a new group. That's usually the best way to set things up so that we can hit the ground with the child not having to worry so much about somebody finding out or somebody being likely to be mistreated. The beginning of new sports season, again, the trend here is at the beginning of activities if at all possible. The start of a new friendship might be a time for a disclosure. And not just disclosing to the friend, but perhaps the parents. So if your son or daughter is going to be spending time in someone else's home and you believe that their symptoms could become problematic or noticeable in that environment, you may want to inform the child, the friend's family, so that they have a sense of sort of what's going on, so they know how to react appropriately, which with most of these disorders, it's ignore it. And with more severe disorders, of course, if there's crisis, then it could be preparing the family that your child is spending time with on how to deal with that crisis. Or whenever. There doesn't really need to be perfect timing. It can be just simply when the child decides that he or she is ready to disclose. Who to disclose to? Trusted members of the community, school, faculty, and staff, group, team, or community leaders. These are all sort of good starting points as to who to disclose to so that we can trickle the message down. The whole group or community. Of course, this depends. So not just community in terms of the entire city of, so I'm currently at my office in East Brunswick. It'd probably be hard to disclose to the entire community, town of East Brunswick, but what I mean by community is, again, different groups or organizations that one belongs to. How to disclose? Start by selecting trusted people to disclose to, educate them, and empower them to tell others. So I think that's often a helpful thing as well. So, of course, completely with the child's consent, we want to select certain people that we trust and who we think can do a good job of educating others, not as sort of gossiping, but to help the process along. Some kids I work with dread the idea of having to tell their story 1,000 times, which sometimes is why talking to a group, like a classroom or in a school assembly, can be helpful if the child is too frightened of that. But even, just getting the word around by telling a few people and saying, hey, can you tell the rest of the group? If the child isn't comfortable telling the rest of the group, can be a good way of starting things. Meeting with and educating a community group team leader and plan to address and educate the group. So this is another part of how we can disclose. So not just sort of starting the grapevine for moving, but maybe even setting up a specific situation. So at the next meeting, at the next class presentation, etc. Having an experienced clinician meet with a group to provide a workshop or peer in service. This is one of the things that I love doing for New Jersey Center for Tourette's Syndrome is I go into schools and I meet with faculty and staffs and I educate them about these kind of things. I also can meet with the peers, so I often meet with the classmates of somebody who has a mental illness to educate them about the mental illness, it's often a really sort of powerful experience. Just to tell you a bit more about those peer in services, typically what happens is I'll go in without actually naming the child, but usually in advance I will speak with the family, and I ask the family for permission at some point in the presentation to disclose to a classroom who the child is that has the specific mental illness that I'm presenting on. Most of the time, I'd say 90% of the time, families have been perfectly agreeable to this, and it's usually best case scenario. But it's not necessary. If the child really isn't comfortable being the center of attention, they can choose to be absent from school that day or from that class that day, or I can present in a vague way without actually specifically naming the child who's struggling with it. But often best case scenario, again, is I come in, I give some information about a disorder. I give some information about how to respond, that would, a way to respond that would be the most helpful. And at the end, I might invite the person who has a mental illness to join the group and have the group ask questions and speak to the group briefly. And I find that's a really powerful and meaningful experience on many levels. Have the person with the mental illness prepare a presentation. I think this is also a great thing to do, not just sort of helping people deal with public speaking phobias, but again, I think it can be really helpful in that the person with the mental illness, they know what he or she wants their class to know about or the community to know about. He or she probably has the best ideas as to what can you do that can help me. And in fact, I think that's a point that I didn't make in any of the slides that you guys should all be aware of, is that very often we try and come up with great ideas as to how to help our kids. It's really important to ask our kids, what do you want us to do differently, or how do you want us to respond to these things? Almost always kids, especially with things like OCD and Tourette's, will just say, just ignore it. Maybe more with things like depression, it might be, hey, can you just check in on me, but do it discreetly? Can you make sure to sort of just like give me some special time, or these are all sort of ways to sort of help them deal with it. But again, we want to make sure that the child is coming up with the ideas, because they're more likely, of course, to hone in on what can be most helpful, but also they're most likely to cooperate with the idea if it's their idea and not ours. So we sometimes might want to lead the witness about, gee, I wonder how we could educate your classroom. Do you have any ideas? And sometimes kids will say to me, well, could you come to the class? And it's kind of what I was hoping they would say, but if they're the ones who say it first, there's often more buy-in. Social media. Now again, this would be completely, I think, up to the family's comfort, and especially the person who has the mental illness. But I can think of a friend of mine who didn't formally announce that their child had a mental illness, but I started noticing on their Facebook page that they started posting a lot of things about autism. And now this person was a non-clinician, and I wasn't entirely aware of the fact that they had a child who was autistic. And then, slowly but surely, on their Facebook feed, they might show like a picture of their child going to an Autism Speaks event or walking at a rally and how proud they are of them. And I think that was, I don't know if it was conscious, but it was sort of a way of breaking it into the community and letting people know without having to make a big to-do about it. And I think it's helpful because certainly if I were to go to this person's house, I might have a greater sense of what their child is struggling with and to be more sensitive to some of these issues. And of course, as adults, we have to balance the idea of being sensitive to someone's issues while also not infantilizing them or treating them like they are not just an ordinary kid, because they are. They're ordinary kids who have ordinary struggles that lots of people struggle with. So again, I think social media might be a good way to slowly get the word out and educate people about subtle things. One of my friends also, again, whose child is on the autism spectrum, often posts articles on how to sort of make parties easier for someone on the autism spectrum to deal with. And it was helpful to me because at some point, I have a 1-year-old, so we don't have a lot of kids over for parties, but at some point, if he does have a child over who's autistic, I might be able to think of some helpful ideas for that child to make the experience of coming to my son's party a little bit easier for that child, because we want to be sensitive to some members of the community, but also sort of have them still feel like an important and valued member of the community. So now that we've talked about different ideas about when to disclose, how to disclose, I want to give you a few examples of ways in which disclosure can happen. So case example number 1. Sally is a 10-year-old who is a member of the Girl Scouts. She has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, combined type. So for those of you who may not know, very often people say ADD. Technically, there is no ADD, there's ADHD. Now there's ADHD that's inattentive. These are the children who maybe have a hard time focusing and paying attention. There is hyperactive. So they may be able to focus, but they appear very hyperactive. And the combined type is where you have both, the inattention and the hyperactivity. So Sally has both. So she's not on medication. She's outgoing, energetic, motivated, and always the first to volunteer to help. However, during meetings, she has a tendency to blurt out her ideas and sometimes interrupt others. She can also be a bit hyper and has difficulty sitting still. Her peers get annoyed with her in these situations, and even the troop leaders sometimes slip and openly express their frustration through body language and passive-aggressive comments. By the way, I should let you guys know, since I'm a psychologist, that all these examples that I'm going to give are kind of amalgamations. They're components of different patients I've worked with, but I'm not referring to any specific patient. So if any of you out there in internet land are patients of mine, and this sounds like you, it's not intended to be an exact copy of one of my patients, but this is just, again, different bits and pieces from different types of cases I've worked with over the years. Anyhow, so this is Sally's case. So intervention number 1, how do we help Sally? So first of all, in this situation, we had Sally's mother explain to the troop leader that Sally has ADHD and explained her reasons why the family has not decided to medicate her. And I think this is an important thing as well, because very often people will put a lot of pressure on families and even children. They'll ask, well, did you take your medication today? And if the child says, I'm not on medication, they will get sometimes an unfavorable response. And although I'm not opposed to medication, I certainly can understand a parent's hesitation to put their child on certain medications and to see if accommodations and psychotherapy can be helpful before going that route. So that's why I think it might be important for Sally's mother to explain why medication was not chosen, to sort of help educate others as to what the options are, but also, I guess, for Sally, to Sally's mother, to mitigate her concern that people will judge her for not putting her child on medication. So we discussed ways to have this discussion with the group that she was talking to. She also points out some situations where Sally has reported or her mother has witnessed unkind behavior towards her daughter. So I think it's important that we point out the behaviors that were happening that were not helpful for Sally, that were making her feel alienated and uncomfortable and unwelcome. Not because we are looking to make somebody feel bad, but because, you know, we want people to be more aware of sort of their body language and how their response is, and hopefully even in the future to be a little bit more empathic about, you know, before you have an understanding as to why someone's behaving the way they do, that you shouldn't jump to the conclusion that they are choosing to be disruptive or annoying to you just because you are feeling annoyed. And so again, the reason for this is not because my recommendation isn't that anyone be disciplined. It's actually about sort of helping people understand. Now, what I would say is moving forward, if there is any mistreatment, so once this information has gotten out, once we've educated others on what the disorder is and how we want to be treated respectfully, then I think beyond that, then certainly I do think organizations should have some idea as how they would want to respond to misbehavior and mistreatment. But the point of the disclosure itself is should not be, in my opinion, a request for someone to be punished or disciplined. And the reason for that, again, is that even though these behaviors aren't appropriate, we also want to have some wiggle room for the idea that sometimes that when children aren't perfectly informed, the community is not perfectly informed, they may respond in a way that they think is appropriate and not realize that it isn't. And I think even more importantly, we don't want to start off a new spirit of cooperation with the idea that somebody's going to get in trouble, especially if we believe that that person would not have behaved the way they did had they been better informed. Now, this also doesn't mean that we are blaming the family for not informing sooner and that it's your fault that your child got mistreated. No child should ever be mistreated in any situation. But I think we're accounting for human nature. And to be honest with you, I think in part, this is my own projection, because I think when I was a young child, I might not have understood what Tourette's is or OCD or social phobia, and I might have responded in an unkind way, even if I was not particularly an unkind child. I was actually a pretty sensitive, nice kid, believe it or not. but I think because I would have been misinformed back then and wouldn't know how to handle it, I might have responded in a way that's not helpful. Sally's mother shares information with a troop leader about accommodations for ADHD. Again, I think this is really important, to have the family educate others about how we can be helpful. The troop leader suggested that it's an excellent opportunity to teach other scouts about differences. Sally volunteers to give a presentation on ADHD at the next scout meeting. This opens up future conversations from other troop members about ways in which they are different. And so even though this is not exactly what happened with one of my patients, I did have a different situation where suddenly a classroom started talking about, like, you know, respecting diversity and differences, and a lot of kids talked about little issues they had that people weren't aware of, and I thought that was really neat that one of my patients disclosure sort of led to other helpful disclosures and helped people be even more empathic and understanding about differences. The troop meetings now allow for more movement during meetings and presentations. Troop members now know how Sally would like to be helped and offer it when necessary. Case example number 2. John is a 15-year-old with religious obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. His OCD causes him to frequently engage in frequent prayer rituals that he believes have to be done perfectly, or God will be offended and he will go to hell. The compulsion is triggered when he thinks he had an inappropriate thought or that he may have done something to offend God. I've worked with a lot of cases like this, and very often this starts to emerge during adolescence when people maybe naturally start having more inappropriate thoughts. But not necessarily so. Sometimes pre-adolescents will worry about that kind of thing as well. His rituals are mostly mental, so most people don't even know he's doing them. He is resisting exposure and response prevention therapy because he believes that if he doesn't give in to his OCD, he will offend God, who may be the one asking him to do the rituals in his mind, and will go to hell if he doesn't give in to the ritual, because if God's telling you to do it, you should do it. And so certainly, again, with these mental rituals, they may not be noticeable, but they can be very distressing even if people can't tell from the outside. So intervention number 2. Family contacted the priest that John likes the best from his church, Father Bill, and Father Bill collaborates with John's therapist, who educates Father Bill about OCD and his treatment. And for those of you who don't know, the main treatment for OCD that all the research backs is what's called exposure and response prevention. Exposure and response prevention, in a nutshell, is basically whatever your OCD tells you to do, don't do it. Whatever your OCD tells you not to do, you do it. So you face your fears, you don't let OCD boss you around. So anyway, once Father Bill understood more about OCD, he met with John to discuss his fears and helped John understand that a lot of his fears are more based in OCD than any actual beliefs that the church or the religion subscribes to. So very often, especially in Christian or Catholic religion, the number 3 becomes a special number because the concept of a trinity is important. So this young man would have to do certain prayers 3 times, and of course the priest explained to him, Father Bill explained to him that there's actually nothing in the actual religion or any of the religious learnings that say you have to do these things 3 times, and so that would tell me that it's more your OCD. And so they had some lively and interesting discussions about sort of whether or not this might be God telling him to do something and testing his faith versus OCD, and that's an important discussion to have. Father Bill and John's therapist collaborate on exposure exercises that would not be considered a violation of the church's teachings. Now, I think this is important as well, is to make sure that the father is respected as the priest or father is respected as the authority on religion, and that we not be asking the child to do anything that would actually be considered to be offensive or against the church's teachings. And so we have to be sensitive to this as well, which at times can be difficult, because I've worked with some people who come from some very strict religious backgrounds who say things like that it's sinful to have inappropriate thoughts, and so then we have to make the distinction between experiencing a thought and thinking something on purpose. But we won't dive into that too much. Father Bill and John then do some exposure exercises together, sometimes in the church. So we might have John do some things that he considers blasphemous, or that feel blasphemous, I should say, but that Father Bill assured him were not. And then we might have him do those things, again, as a way of fighting back and doing exposure against OCD. Case number 3. Eddie is a 3rd grader with Tourette's syndrome. His main motor tic is facial grimacing that causes him to have an exaggerated smile or a scrunched up face. Sometimes, maybe once or twice a day, his vocal tics will cause him to make gulping noises or a series of squeaks that are very noticeable, especially during tests. His teacher knows he has Tourette's and is good at ignoring the tic, but Eddie doesn't react much when he has the tic because he's used to people in his family ignoring them because they don't seem to mind much. However, his classmates are starting to shoot him some dirty looks, reprimand him, or laugh at him. The teacher tells them to mind their own business. They make fun of him behind his back, but he's also caught them imitating him on occasion. They're starting to exclude him from lunch, recess, and after-school activities. These kids are jerks. Just kidding. They're normal kids, but maybe again in the absence of knowing what's going on, they may be reacting in a way that we don't care for too much. Anyhow, so intervention number 3. The teacher makes the family aware of the situation, but feels like her hands are tied because she does not have the family's permission to disclose his condition to the class. The family seeks advice from the New Jersey Center for Tourette's Syndrome and Associated Disorders, and because they are brilliant and awesome, they send in their most amazing and handsome presenter, a doctor who works in East Brunswick, who will remain unnamed, but he's super cool. So I can't hear you guys, but I imagine you're all laughing very hard right now, so I'll give you a second to catch your breath, and we'll move on. Dr. Zambrano, I mean the doctor who will remain unnamed, goes into the school and does an in-service for the faculty of the school and a peer in-service for the whole 3rd grade. Eddie volunteers to be introduced at the end of the peer in-service and answers the 3rd graders' questions. A mean kid cries and an angel gets his wings. Now, here's what I mean by this. I've actually given a presentation like this, and at the end, the child did speak to the class and explained, that he just wants the rest of the class to ignore his tics, to understand that he can't help it, and it actually makes him really nervous if he's worried that other people are judging him. And at the end of the class, I remember this kid raised his hand, and he stood up, and his little lip was quivering, and he got a little teary-eyed. And he just apologized to the child who had Tourette's and said, "I've been making fun of you all year, and I didn't know that you had Tourette's. I'm so sorry. I didn't know it wasn't your fault." And I actually found out afterwards that I wouldn't say that they became best friends, but that they got friendly with one another. And I like to imagine that maybe moving forward, this kid stood up for the child who had Tourette's. So it was really fascinating to watch, and I think hopefully moving forward he has a classroom full of kids who understand him and are willing to protect him and look out for him in the future when other kids maybe make fun or tease. 4th and final example. Paula is a 14-year-old. She's had some very mild tics for many years that no one ever noticed. Therefore, there was no apparent need for disclosure. She's a bit of a late bloomer, but with the onset of puberty, her tics became more noticeable. Mainly body twisting, so sometimes people twist their body and get frozen into certain poses, or just make weird movements that are pretty noticeable. And abdominal tensing, so I've had people who will tense and then relax, almost look like their stomach is rolling or moving up and down. So these are different kinds of motor tics that people can experience. At school, nobody seemed to notice, but in gymnastics, which was very competitive and where her coaches were very strict, the tics were worse. She was having an increasingly difficult time controlling the tics, and she was very afraid that others would notice. So she started to miss a lot of practice and was close to being kicked off of the main squad and missing competitions that were very important to her. Most of the competitors didn't go to her school, so she decided to quit gymnastics and disappear from the team. Intervention number 4. Her parents were encouraged not to force her to go back to the gym until she was ready. A less intense gymnastics program was considered because it was believed that anxiety exacerbated her tics. And in this situation, we're talking about maybe somebody who enjoys gymnastics but isn't gunning for the Olympics or anything like that. So, they looked for a program that they heard was a little bit less rigorous and intense. We discussed the benefits of disclosing her Tourette's to her teammates. We started by telling close friends who were not on the team to see how they would react. From there on, she started to be more open about it with some of her classmates. And what she found, which is typically the case, is people didn't really judge that much. She didn't really get teased. Maybe every now and then her friends might say something, some silly joke about cursing or saying inappropriate words, because very often the misconception about Tourette's is that people with Tourette's often curse, where it's really only a small percentage of them. But nothing that she couldn't handle that she found terribly upsetting. She chose a different place to do gymnastics, but shared details about her TS with some of her old gymnastic friends, one of whom switched to the new gym too. She gave them permission to tell others if they wanted to or were asked. So, this was helpful in case, she ever bumped into one of her old gymnastics teammates and they asked, "Hey, what happened?" or, "Why did you quit the team?" Or if she just didn't want to go through the process of explaining about her Tourette's, she gave some of her old friends permission to disclose to the others if they were curious or if they felt like they wanted to share it on their own. And again, the benefit not just for this young lady in case she ever bumped into them, but we can even say for society in general, that the more we get the word out and educate others, the better. She immediately disclosed to the new gym what her symptoms were so that she wouldn't be so afraid of others finding out. She was better able to focus, and she actually had fewer tics. She really blossomed as a gymnast in her new situation. So even though it was a less competitive and intense environment, it sort of gave her the ability to be more focused on her performance rather than on people finding out finding out about her tics. Okay, so that's about it for the formal part of this presentation. And I am going to, I guess, open it up now for any questions.
Okay, and I think we're good to go here. So thank you. That was a lot of really great information, and definitely appreciate your time tonight. So let's talk about what we have. So regarding bullying, this question is, are you personally aware of any research that's been done on the effects of bullying if a child chooses to disclose their disability or not?
Okay. To be honest, I'm not aware of any specific research on, because it's a very specific question, right? So the idea of how often are people bullied after disclosing their disorder. So I can't quote specific research, which I hate to not be able to do because I am trained in sort of a scientist practitioner model where we're supposed to quote research. I'm not aware of any at the moment. Hopefully, maybe New Jersey's Center for Tourette Syndrome is. What I will say is just anecdotally, I've been working with kids with Tourette's for it's almost 9-10 years now, and it's been very rare that I've heard of people getting bullied directly. I hear more about maybe somebody becoming aware of being teased behind their back, somebody maybe saying an insensitive joke or something like that. But if we're talking about actual bullying in terms of sort of persistent being picked on, teased, made fun of on a regular basis, it doesn't seem to happen too often. The research might say differently, but my experience, and I've worked with a lot of kids with Tourette's over many years, usually the bullying happens, let's put it this way, it happens as much after the disclosure, or maybe even slightly less after the disclosure as it did before. And I think the reason why it might happen less after the disclosure rather than before, especially with Tourette's, but with other disorders as well, is when, as I mentioned during the webinar, when people don't know what's going on, then they have a lot of misinformation and bad ideas. So I can even say that I once had a patient, actually, who randomly kind of told me that, oh, there's this kid in my classroom, and he's really annoying, and he's weird, and I feel really uncomfortable sitting next to him because he's always like tapping his desk and making weird noises. And this young man, I think he might have been a 5th grader, and he had heard of Tourette's, but he didn't think that this kid had Tourette's. He thought he was just faking it and trying to get attention, or was intended trying to annoy him. So he was a nice kid, so I don't think he was actually bullying the young man who had Tourette's. But what I would say is that is probably the situation where somebody is more likely to be bullied, right? When somebody doesn't know what's going on, and they just assume this kid is being annoying on purpose. So again, I'm just looking at anecdotal evidence. I don't have a ton of experience with people who have disclosed coming back and telling me that they regretted disclosing because now people are picking on them. Again, because keep in mind, the symptoms, especially with Tourette's, but some of the other disorders, are pretty obvious, or often obvious before the disclosure is made. So I think what tends to happen is once the disclosure is made and explained appropriately, and especially this is another reason why we want people in the community to be aware of this as well, the school probably did start doing a better job of protecting the child once the teachers knew, once they knew what to look for, and once they sort of understood the potential for teasing that happened. I think maybe some policing of these kind of things happened more effectively.
Yeah, that's a good point, though, in your experience, that you haven't had someone come to you and say, oh, that was the worst thing I ever did. So that's really a point made there.
The disclosure itself was really difficult. They might have been very nervous when they gave the presentation. So they might say it was very hard, but I can't recall a time where someone actually said they regretted disclosing to others and talking about what their disorder is.
Okay.
That's not to say there aren't occasional downsides, but for the most part, yeah, I haven't heard a lot of it.
Okay. This is kind of a follow-up to that, but in a sense. So do you think that it's easier to disclose, let's call it Tourette in this case, about a mental health issue when the individual is in elementary school than it would be if the child was, say, in middle school? In other words, I guess they're asking, does it get harder to do it as the child gets older?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a big factor. And that, really, I think as you enter adolescence, even though it's weird because it's an age where individuation happens more, you also at that age group developmentally don't want sort of to be ostracized from the group. And so I think they're more conscious of the possibility of being singled out. And again, I think that danger happens when you perceive yourself as different. I think we too often view different as bad rather than just different. And so I think a teenager or an adolescent is more vulnerable to that idea. If I come out, if I am viewed as different, then I will be rejected. And I think that idea is a far more powerful and salient idea at that age than it is in elementary school. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, again, and if you talk to a lot of teachers, you'll see this as well, is that a lot of sort of social phobia starts to pop up a little bit more as you get older. So, you know, you more often see people start to have social anxiety in school or social phobia or presentation phobia when they're 11, 12, 13, you know, as they're entering adolescence, versus a kid having to do it when they're an 8-year-old. So I've had parents come in, you know, who will describe these kind of things. It's really hard for me to present in front of a class, or for my child to present in front of a class, and I don't understand why, because they used to do it all the time when they were in the 3rd grade, and now suddenly they can't. So I think that, again, speaks to sort of the developmental difference, that during adolescence in particular, there's more of a fear of being judged, singled out, and then perhaps rejected from the group. Mm-hmm. So I think the earlier we can do this, the better. And it's often a hard sell. I've had lots of parents over the years who I've said, I think maybe you should disclose this, even if it's not disruptive yet, even if it's not noticeable yet, because very often, especially with something like Tourette's, during puberty the symptoms can get much worse. And that's true of a lot of these disorders that are associated with Tourette's. So, you know, it's easier to get a 8-year-old to talk about it than an 11-year-old or a 14-year-old. And so, you know, I did have a situation like this where, again, a 14-year-old symptoms got much worse, and the 14-year-old left school, and we had a very hard time getting that person to return to school because they were so afraid of people noticing the Tourette's symptoms, even if the symptoms actually weren't terribly noticeable, but they became a little bit more noticeable as that person aged. And I just always imagined what would have happened if this person could have told their class when they were 8, 9, or 10 versus 14 or 15. I think it would have been much easier, and I think that child might not have missed as much time from school as he did. We wouldn't have gotten as much resistance about disclosing to others as we got. So there could be some value in disclosing a little bit earlier than necessary because it's much harder to do it later.
Okay. So how would you recommend handling a family situation? So there's a 13-year-old sib who is embarrassed by the younger brother's tics and is saying negative things about the younger brother, who in this case is 9 years old. So I think the issue here is the 13-year-old must be angry and frustrated and thinks this younger kid is getting special treatment and is taking it out by bad-mouthing him, it would seem.
Sure. That's difficult because, you know, on the one hand, certainly as a parent, you want to protect the younger child from being mistreated by somebody who perhaps has unfair resentment of the child or is just embarrassed and doesn't know how to manage that embarrassment. As much as possible, and as hard as it might be to do, I would resist the urge to punish the older child because I think that's only going to create greater resentment. And now not only is my 9-year-old brother or sister so annoying and weird, quote unquote, but now I'm getting in trouble because of him or her. So, you know, as much as possible, certainly, and outside of the heat of a moment, we want the parents to be able to sit down with a 13-year-old and explain the disorder if it's not already clearly explained, to, you know, help them understand the negative impact that they're having on the other child, but also to reach out and say, how can I help you? My assumption always is if someone is acting out, they're struggling in some way, they are suffering in some way, so how can we teach you how to manage your embarrassment more effectively? And that might even be sort of if the 9-year-old gives the 13-year-old permission to disclose, to be able to explain to his or her peers, my little brother or little sister has Tourette's, she can't help it, he can't help it, just feel free to ignore it. And I think that becomes way less embarrassing than the idea of having a friend over and that friend just thinks your 9-year-old sibling is a weirdo and attention-seeking, and etc. So I think that might be another situation where disclosure can be valuable. But again, we want to make sure that we don't jump straight to punishment, and instead sort of look at what are the resources that the 13-year-old is missing. How can I help you cope with your embarrassment? How can I help you have greater empathy for your brother or sister? What can I help you do when you're dealing with this? So, for example, many years ago I worked with, and this happens often, I worked with a young child who had a tic that involved screaming. And we're talking extremely loud screaming that like was very unsettling. I remember at the time that I was working with this young man, the symptoms were so disruptive that I always had to make sure that I scheduled him for a Sunday afternoon because I'm the only person in my practice who works on Sundays. So at the very least, we wouldn't be disrupting the rest of the practice or frightening people, but we could also gave this child the opportunity to let the tics out if he or she needed to. So anyhow, but then part of what I'd have to do is also meet with their sibling and help them come up with strategies for how do you deal more effectively with what is genuinely unnerving and hard to deal with. And so part of it was we had him get some of those awesome Beats by Dre earphones, and so he was very excited about that part. And he could wear them and walk outside the room when his or her brother started screaming. His brother started screaming uncontrollably, because sometimes these vocal tics would last more than a minute or two. And so that might be one way we help sort of not demonize a person for having a normal reaction. It is unnerving to have somebody screaming, and sometimes, as hard as we try to be patient, we lose patience. You know, I know this now more than ever. I have a 1-year-old at home, and sometimes, as much as I love him, sometimes when you can't get him to calm down, you lose patience, and you're yelling at a 1-year-old, and you realize, wow, I'm being an idiot. And so, and I'm a grown-up, and I teach people how to deal with this stuff. So to expect a 13-year-old to be perfectly composed and rational when something very uncomfortable is happening around them is unrealistic and unfair. So we should approach them from a spirit of, can I help educate you? What can I do to help you deal with this more effectively, rather than yelling at them and making them feel bad and punishing them. Now, if you go beyond that point and they don't use the tools and they're just choosing to be cruel and unkind, then I do think punishment is appropriate, as well as perhaps rewarding them when they are able to respond correctly.
Well, I can imagine that younger brother being happy to see the older brother get his comeuppance a little bit and maybe get grounded or something out of the misbehavior of the older kid.
Sure, but we might have to explain to the younger child how to have empathy and understanding for your older brother. And you know, we may have to talk in a matter-of-fact way. In other words, to say to that 9-year-old, we know you're not being annoying on purpose, but you do understanding hearing these noises are annoying to people sometimes, and so it's not your fault. It's our job to help them learn how to deal with that more effectively. So it's a tricky conversation to have, but I think it's an important one.
With both of them, yeah.
Absolutely.
I have a question that got posted, and I'm a little confused by part of it, so I'm going to ask the part that I'm not confused about. It has to do with handling family members that are in denial of the diagnosis.
Oh, yeah. Any more to that question, or no?
No, that's it. I don't quite get what they mean by the first part, so we'll stick with that one unless they want to.
I've certainly experienced that in the past, is that there's one family member who gets it. I understand that my son has OCD or my daughter has Tourette's or depression or what have you, and then there's another family member who may think he or she is just faking it, or thinks it's, you know, that all this mental illness stuff is just an excuse, and if you don't have to make those sounds if you don't want to. You don't have to take an hour-long shower and use a ton of soap if you didn't want to. And of course, as a therapist, I try and teach people you don't have to give in to your OCD, but I do believe that they have a problem and that they're struggling with something. And so it is problematic when a family member doesn't think that there's a legitimate problem and that that child is just doing their best to annoy them or be inappropriate, or that they're being attention-seeking. So that's a tough situation. I mean, my job then, of course, is to do my best to sort of explain to them in as educated a manner as I can, but also empathize with them as well, because, I mean, if you start off by making somebody feel bad about themselves, they can become defensive and shut down. So, you know, maybe in private with just the one parent in the room, I could sort of say, hey, I get it. This must be really annoying or difficult to deal with. And so to say, hey, if I didn't know any better, I might react the same way. If I didn't have the training I had, I might react the same way. You know, and part of that denial maybe is about, you know, a person's insecurities, their own feeling that maybe this is my fault, maybe I did something wrong, maybe they inherited it from me. That's often the case, actually, with these families who are in denial, or these family members that are in denial. So as much as we can, we explain to them in a gentle and non-judgmental way, but then we also help them sort of, maybe we start with, what can you do as a parent that's more effective in dealing with this? And as they see that their responses are more effective, maybe then their anger is decreased, and they can then deal with the emotion behind the anger more effectively.
I've seen it happen with this denial of, whatever the diagnosis is, that it even providing information sometimes doesn't seem to make any difference either.
Yeah.
It's anyway. This individual who posted part of the question I didn't quite understand. Her question was, it's slightly unrelated, but it relates to TS, so I think I would like to touch on it here. And she talks about good and bad days. So, and I was trying to clarify that, did she mean with TS? So she said yes. And so could you just talk about that for just a moment, to how there are good and bad days?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think especially with Tourette's, but just with anything really, there can be a naturally waxing and waning kind of course of this. Now, one of the things I try and teach educators and people in the community that I talk to is that a lot of different things can exacerbate Tourette's syndrome. So a bad night's sleep, not feeling well, being anxious about something, all those things can make Tourette's symptoms worse, or any symptom of any mental illness for that matter. But what we also acknowledge is that sometimes there's no good reason, it's just you're just having a bad day. So call it what you will, call it biorhythms, call it a full moon, whatever it is, sometimes we just have rougher days than others. But I think we want to understand is that I think sometimes people get confused about that and think, oh, well, this means they can control it if they wanted to, or they could do better than this. And so just because people sometimes have better days doesn't mean that they're not trying to have a good day today. And I think, again, that's very common with most forms of mental illness, is that sometimes we get lucky and we feel okay, or we rise to the occasion, and other days we just can't.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. I'm going to, in fact, we've gone a little over, but I want to ask you one more question, and you don't need to, you can be as brief as you choose to be. Okay. This question has to do with a child who is in elementary school and wants to explain to a friend, in this case about his tics, but the parents are reluctant. So the child seems eager with this, but the parents are not so much.
Right. I mean, certainly I would want the parents to see this presentation and explain to them sort of the benefits of this. Ultimately, and this is difficult, especially with a young elementary school child. When I work with as a psychologist with them, part of my job is to explain that I work for you. And so my job is to help you decide what you think is best for you, and then give to you strategies for how to execute that. So although I would not want to undermine a parent's authority, right, I might want to test that to be able to say, hey, this is your life, your disorder, your body. If you truly want to disclose this to somebody and you think it would be valuable, I guess what's the old saying? It's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And short of a parent saying, I forbid you to disclose this, then not that I would encourage a child to do that, but I would encourage them to do what they think is best for their well-being. Now, it's different, I suppose, if a parent says, I absolutely forbid you from disclosing this, in which case, again, then it's our job to try and help educate the parents as to the potential benefits of disclosure.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to end it here. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight. I'm going to switch this back to Kelly to handle the wrap-up.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining our webinar on disclosure part 2. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is now open and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archive recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the site. Our next presentation, Sibling Issues, will be presented by Dr. Graham Hartke and is scheduled for January 25th, 2017. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Zambrano, for your presentation, And thank you everyone for attending. Happy holidays and good night.